After 8 years of Shadowverse, we finally got the final expansion. So now that all of the cards have been released, as we are waiting for Worlds Beyond, let's take some time to reflect and try to answer this question. What were the best 20 cards of Shadowverse of all time? And among them, which one is the best? To claim for the title of the best card, I think there are a few criteria a card can have. It could be cards that made you want to rage quit when they were played on curve, or an incredible engine card that made its deck a top tier, or an insane win condition that was unavoidable. There has been 30 expansions, and thousands of cards have been released. So making the selection was very hard. So to choose only 20 cards, I had to cut some. Here you can see a bunch of honorable mentions, that I consider could be part of the top 40. Keep in mind this top is subjective, it's only my opinion. I think that if you ask 100 players, you'll get 100 different tops. But as someone that played in every meta since 2017, played in 5 Contenders Cup and 2 World Grand Prix, I can definitely tell you which card I felt were very oppressive at their time. So without further ado, let's go right into it. Number 20, Dark Fistbat. DFB, for short, is part of one of the first quest deck, a kind of deck where you repeat an action X times to enable certain effects. While the Warp keyword didn't exist back then, the Lost Blood deck from Omen of the Ten aimed to damage its leader at least 7 times to enable Valnarek, as well as getting scaling damage on DFB. The more times you damage yourself during the game, the more damage DFB will be when you play it. This deck was so aggressive, notably because you could summon Flowers from your deck before the evolution turns, but you didn't really need to deal 20 in a turn. The first DFB at 8 or 10 damage would be enough, but if the game goes on, the damage on DFB will continue to grow, and back-to-back DFB was also a solid way to win for the deck. When Bloodsucker of the Night was printed, DFB reappeared in rotation as a way to close the game on turn 10, and the deck at this time could really have a DFB at 20 damage. Number 19, Natural Machinas. Have you ever dreamed of changing your whole hand, and that your new hand costs 0? Well, this was exactly what Natural Machinas did, on top of clearing a big follower. Created right before all of the good Machina cards from Steel Rebellion were about to rotate, it completely shifted the meta around it as it created insane plays. Machina Blood could prepare big tempo swings and the turn after make a Nautica with mono. Machina Even, with Limonia on top of Natural Machinas, could basically play forever and make boards full of 10-10s. Natural Dragon could ramp into Natural Machinas, get a ton of trees and just increase the damage that Valdane was dealing at the end of the turn. So during that time, it was very hard to justify playing a deck that didn't play Natural Machinas. Hopefully, right after that, all of the good cards that Nature could search for rotated, and after that, it became basically useless. Number 18, Prime Dragon Keeper. PDK, for short, came at a time where it was still hard to clear boards, or draw a lot of cards, or dealing a lot of damage in one turn. So she fit a pretty unique role, because she turned all of your early game followers, the 1-3 costs that were only good in the early game, into easy board clears and damage. And because she couldn't be attacked, unless your opponent had a removal spell for her, she could stay alive for a long time. The play was often to pre-evolve her, and not attacking with her, to make her a 7 HP follower and make sure she's out of the range of most removals. Back then the best answer was Dance of Death, which was 5 cost. So your opponent had to take their whole turn to take out the PDK, and you still had your other follower on the board. And if you leave her on the board, you're never taking the board again. It was the best deck during Starfall Legend when it was released, with only D-Shift being able to stop it, but then she was nerfed to 4 cost and 3 HP, to be easier to clear for all classes. But despite that, during the Omen of the Ten meta, at WGP 2018, she was played again in Realm Dragon, where in combination with Poseidon and Masamune, she was part of the best deck once again. Number 17, Paracely's Demon of Greed. One of the main weaknesses of aggressive decks is that they usually don't run a lot of draw and can run out of cards pretty early. Endless Blood turned this drawback into an advantage. If you start the turn with 0 cards in hand, you are rewarded with a 3/3 coming from the deck, an extra draw, 2 damage and 2 healing. But what if you draw Paracely's? Well, discarding Paracely's gets back 2 copies in the deck, so with the right draws, you could just invoke Paracely's every turn, and eventually get enough damage to finish the opponent. A Revolve effect lets you damage the ward, and discard 3 cards to make sure that you are handless again. In combination with Full Moon Sprint, you could clear a ward with the Evolve, and deal 7 storm damage for only 2 play points. While this strategy was not the most consistent one, because you still needed to draw Full Moon Sprint at the right time, Endless Blood was a very popular deck during the whole duration Paracely's was in rotation. She also became one of the best decks of Unlimited, where it's possible to empty your hand on turn 1. Number 16, Grimnir Void War. When this version of Grimnir came out, it was pretty easy to evolve 5 followers in the game, with many followers that could evolve by effect, or that didn't cost any evolution points. So this made Grimnir very splashable. You would see it in a lot of archetypes. If you could empty your opponent's board, Grimnir was 10 damage to their leader, and double Grimnir for 8 play points was 20 damage. Evolved Blood also had Seahawks, creating a dilemma for the opponent. If they play a board, they're going to die to Seahawks. If they don't play a board, they're going to die to Grimnir. It was also one of the stars of WGP 2021, where it was played in Evo Rune, in combination with Tetra for a lot of damage, and it was the card that gave KKP his title of World Champion. Number 15. Flame and Glass, Duality. So Flame and Glass are cards from the classic set, revolving around a very meme strategy, where you hope that both Flame and Glass survive a turn, so they can fuse and become a giant follower. This new card made it possible to run them, but it was only to get fused. On release, this card was played in Resonance Portal, where you could shuffle back the extra copies of Flame and Glass you didn't need, and abuse with 0 PP Storm and board wipe. After the card was nerfed to L cost, it was still played, but this time as a reanimate target for Canunos in Evolve Shadow. And that deck didn't even run the Flame and Glass cards from the fusion. This card made us question, should they really make neutral storms that are this good? Because this kind of design isn't really future-proof. If a class is eventually going to abuse it, maybe you shouldn't have made it at all. Number 14. 21. Zelgenea, The World. Very few cards change the game, and force players to always think about it like Zelgenea did. During the 14th hand meta and after, players needed to be careful about not putting their opponent at 14 HP or below, because if they did, your opponent could just play the world, destroy their best follower, heal for 5 and draw 2 cards. You had to always think about whether you wanted to attack your opponent's face or not. It also became one of the win conditions of some decks, because the invoke form could put a clock on the opponent. On turn 10 you could activate this effect, so that everything takes 4 damage at the end of the turn, so no board will survive that. But just like you can play around the base form, you could also play around this invoke form, by not leaving anything on your board, so that Zelgenea couldn't attack and get the strike effect. So even if it was very strong, it was very interesting to play with and against. At the start of the rival meta, there was a wildcard combo in Control Sword, letting you give Storm to the invoke version, and have an UTK for 20 damage, and this was just a bit too much for Cygames that decided to nerf it. The only way to deny the combo was if the player drew all 3 copies of Zelgenea. Which is definitely super unlikely to happen, and absolutely never happened to me. After the nerf, Zelgenea costed 6 PP, and the evolved form couldn't be exploited for OTKs, so it moved from being played in every mid-range deck to only seeing play in control decks, right where it should always have been. Number 13. Jan World Walker. When she was released, we are baffled to see that she didn't get nerfed. In the Crystallized deck, where you use Wingy and Diamond Master to give Storm and Ward to all of your followers and assemble a big OTK, she broke the damage ceiling, creating combos of 26 damage, on top of having this 5 damage AoE to help you clear all of the wards before. But even if you didn't have the OTK, because she gave protection from damage to all of your followers, which were wards, it was almost impossible to counterattack. After Crystallize fell off, she became Elovia's main finisher, being summonable with either, and in the deck, with Elovia's leader effect, you could even buff her to make her storm damage bigger. The only thing Jan was missing was a good Accelerate, because she could be a bit bricky in the early game, but despite that, most 7 decks were still running 3 copies, because it was that important to draw her. Number 12. Alice, Wonderland Explorer. When Wonderland Dream, the 5th expansion for Shadowverse dropped, it was a big push for the game, as Cygames really invested in communication with sponsor videos or ads. I remember being in Japan at that time and seeing Alice in the subway. But at the same time, it was a pretty dark era for Shadowverse. Every class was running the neutral engine, and if you were playing the game at that time, you probably remember that every game was the same. You go turn 1 Goblin, turn 2 Unica, turn 3 Goblin Leader, and turn 4 Alice. If she only buffed your board, or buffed your followers' attack, she would just be a card for aggressive decks, and you would just have to deal with the current board. If she only buffed your hand, she would have been a bit too slow and not played. But the fact she did both meant that there was nothing to do better at that time. So every class ended up being a different flavor of neutral mid-range. She was the main reason for the biggest patch in Shadowverse, nerfing over 10 cards, most of them targeting neutral blood, the best user of Alice. Hopefully, at the end of the expansion cycle, Cygames decided to murder her and nerf her, so that we wouldn't be stuck in a neutral meta forever. Number 11. Absolute Tolerance. So when you look at it, it looks like a pretty meme card. Since it costs 30, you would think it is pretty unrealistic to summon it. But this card actually turned out to be a nightmare to play against. Because how it works is that if you deal 5 damage to 2 different followers, the cost of tolerance will be reduced by 5, not by 2. So with the right support cards, it was very easy to reduce its cost. And since you never reveal it in your hand, your opponent has no way to know if you have it or not. So they have to play around tolerance as a principle, not making 2 big boards, to not let your AoE damage reduce the cost too much. Double tolerance and an evolution point is 20 damage through 2 wards, for potentially 0 play points. I think we all remember that clip from Rage Winter 2021, where W's now got absolutely destroyed. in the game and mentally by a triple tolerance. It is not higher on the list because it has 2 weaknesses. You need 2 copies of it to win the game if the opponent is fully healed, and it's a very bad top deck in the late game as you won't have the time to reduce it. You often need at least 2 or 3 turns to make it playable. Number 10. Dimension Shift. All card games make at least 1 card that can give you an extra turn. Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic, Weiss Schwarz, Hearthstone. And in all of those games, if you can play 2 turns in a row, it's enough to win the game. In Shadowverse, the card that had this effect was D-Shift. When you draw it, it's unplayable, but as you play spells, it becomes cheaper and cheaper. I didn't put it higher on this list, but if I had to make a survey on the most annoying cards ever, D-Shift would probably be top 1. People playing 2 or 3 D-Shifts in a row, BMing their opponent and then taking their sweet time to end the game, was frustrating so many players that some even conceded when they saw Insight on turn 1, just to not have to experience this again. This card was one of the reasons the rotation system was created, because despite how infamous it was still a pretty popular deck, and a big part of the player base really enjoyed this playstyle. It was nerfed to 20 cost, but it was not enough, so they had to find another way to make sure that this kind of problematic card was not gonna be played forever. Number 9. Dragon Oracle. There's very few cards like this that you dread to see in the early. And Dragon Oracle is one of them. When you see it on turn 2, you know the Dragon player is going to have a good game, whether it's you or your opponent. It gave Dragon a natural edge on all of the other decks, because Dragon had the playpoint advantage. They could play bigger followers before their opponents. And getting multiple ramp cards enhanced this advantage even more. Almost every other ramp card that came after was either free cost or tied to a specific archetype, showing that side games knew they must not print another Dragon Oracle, or a card of the same power level. Over 8 years of Shadowverse, the only Dragon decks that didn't play Dragon Oracle were the super aggressive decks, like Back Dragon, or some versions of Buff Dragon. Number 8. Guiding Bellringer Angel. Once again, a neutral card that was a staple in this format. Its ability to ward, take 2 hits and draw after was useful for all archetypes. Aggro and mid-range deck would use it to protect their other followers, and Combo and Control would use it to protect their leader and gain some time. The evolve effect also meant that you couldn't ignore Bellringer, because else you can just evolve it and she becomes giant. If you had 9 cards in hand, it became a 5/7 that could trade a follower for free for only 2 cost. Nothing else would compare. It ended up being played in almost every deck when it was in rotation, and notably in some decks that marked the history of Shadowverse that we'll talk about later. Number 7. Wicked Rebirth. It's one of the most stacked support cards ever. You advance your last word condition by destroying a follower, you get a new follower back, which almost certainly has last word. You draw 2 cards, which meant that you could draw your other copies of Wicked Rebirth easily, and on top of that you have +3 attack and rush on the new follower. You often ended up with a 5 attack follower that could trade with a big follower. And you get your bonus last word effect on top of that, really insane. So it cycles, it advances your conditions for 10 last words, you can even get a second follower in the late game, all of that for 1 cost. Before the nerf, it could revive neutral followers, which meant that you could revive Bellringer, and get the draw on last word 1 more time for even more draw. After the nerf, it was at 2 playing points and you could only revive Shadowcraft followers, so you couldn't revive Bellringer anymore with it, but it meant that you had a bit more control on what you could revive if you adjust your decklist to have exactly some targets. Number 6. Accelerator. So I think you all know, playpoint cheating that isn't capped is insane. When Portal was released in Chronogenesis, the main strategy was to shuffle analyzing artifacts into the deck, play Accelerator, making an infinite trading and draw machine. If you had Deus Ex Machina Zilder effect and Accelerator on the board, every 1 playpoint artifact that you played ended up giving you +1 playpoint. So in some scenarios, the deck could just play forever. Every time Accelerator was in rotation, even as the token threw bad cards, it made artifact at least viable in rotation. And sometimes the top tier, like with the Meisha OTK deck. It was also limited at 1 in Unlimited until very recently. So now we are going to the top 5, the potential best card in the game, and I think you're starting to see which one are left. Number 5. Isabel, Intrepid Mage. The leader cards from Renaissance Chronicle mini-expansion were all strong, but Isabel was just a bit more overtuned. It was an ultra polyvalent card for spell boost, turning your extra followers into useful cards. And their token, Quiet War Magic, created a second quest within the deck, where you needed to play 7 spells with different names to get Elements of Creation. It pushed players to adapt their build, and run a lot of different spells, most of them had 1 or 2 copies, so Isabel really rewarded the good deck builders. Element of Creation itself was 10 damage to the enemy leader, heal 10 for yours, and a secondary effect that was sometimes relevant in Mysteria, and because you have the heal 10, it meant that it was very safe to play back-to-back Elements of Creation, and your opponent rarely had the time to lethal you. Isabel got played in Mysteria Rune, Chrono Witch rune, Kuon rune, and she was basically viable every time that a spellboost win condition was in rotation. Even after the nerf of Quadra Magic and Elements of Creation, it was still an incredible card. Number 4. Grimoire Death Teller. Do you like D-Shift? Well, Grimoire says that now you have D-Shift on every turn. The only condition is to have a high Necromancy card to play on every turn, and you don't get the extra battle phase. But unlike D-Shift, you don't need to draw it to get the effect, as you can just invoke Grimoire filling our quest. So you should never miss Grimoire in a game, which makes the deck ultra consistent. And even if you drew all the copies of Grimoire, contrary to Zalganea, you could just play Grimoire from hand. With both a lot of draw and shadow generation, she could come out on turn 6 or 7 and allow crazy combos, like double trio or double Necro Impulse. You could argue that Necro Impulse maybe should have been in the top, as it was also a keycard in Aggro Shadow, and not only for Grimoire decks, but I think it was Grimoire that was a true enabler for truly unstoppable combos. And as all of the cards in this top 5, she was a keycard of a broken unlimited decks that could kill on turn 6 with double Tyrant. Number 3. Augmentation Bestowal. So, if you thought that Accelerator was good, Augmentation was on another level. If you had both, on turn 3, you could basically draw your whole deck. Contrary to Accelerator, it didn't take any board space, so even if it lasted for only one turn, it was more convenient to use. And there was no drawback to playing double Augmentation. You could either use it to make giant boards in the early game that your opponent just couldn't clear at this state, or use it as a way to refill your hands as you play all of your ship followers. To this day, Augmentation is the only card that is still banned in Unlimited. Number 2. Ladika Verdanclaw. So if you can manage to fill her condition, she's basically a 1 play point 16 damage storm. This is not okay. For 1 week, her deck was at full power with Heroic Resolve, creating OTKs on turn 5 or turn 6 constantly. Then she was played in Accelerate Forest, where you had a card to give her Storm, so you didn't even need to play 12 cards with it. Then she was playing into the Arya Saka deck, where you naturally had a lot of Fairy Wisp, 0 cost followers that you could bounce to enable Ladika. And later on, she was run in a pure combo deck, where you would use Carbuncle to reduce the cost of all of your deck, and create your own Ladika combo just like that. In my opinion, there's only 3 things that stop her from being number 1 on this list. First, she was really dependent on the card pool. If Forest didn't have any 0 cost to play, she was just not playable. So her viability really varied during her time in rotation. Number 2, despite her being 16 damage, you still have to find the last 4 damage. Players got to use cards like Valder, or Alberta, or Shamushama, but these cards weren't always available with Ladika in rotation. And number 3, it's a very hard card to play. You have to play 12 cards, and it's not easy to count if you can do it or not just looking at your hand. And if you go all in and make one mistake, you played your whole hand, you're losing this game. In tournaments, this rarely happened, so she was just a pain to deal with. If you can solve all 3 of these problems, she was definitely one of the most broken cards ever. And now it's time for number 1. And you might have guessed it, it's Skeleton Rider. So Skeleton Rider was the ace card of Alice, in the Switch game and in the anime, but it got completely changed in the main game. The effect could be compared to Defile in Hearthstone, one of the best removals in that game, but you also deal 1 damage face every time you destroy a follower. When you play Skeleton Rider, you destroy your follower, so you can start the chain of 1 damage and you continue as long as you're destroying something. And because its cost was reduced every time you evolve, you could either use it as a combo card, waiting until it got 0 and trying to OTK with it, or you could use it as a mid-range card whenever your opponent was not playing around it and making too much of a board. So while it was an interesting card to play, it really punished players for making boards. So it created a very counterintuitive mindset for all players, that if you play against Shadow, you need to not make boards. You need to not play your cards. Just like Tolerance, there was no way to know if the opponent had Skeleton Rider or not, or to know its cost. So you had to play around it just by fear, just in case they have it. But unlike Tolerance, if you drew it in the late game, you could still Burial Rite a copy and revive it with Carninos, for only 2 play points. And of course, if you get multiple Raiders, the effect stacks and it can definitely OTK. It didn't get nerfed during the whole time it was in rotation, but it totally dominated the WGP 2021, and Evil Shadow stayed at the best deck for the whole time it was in rotation. It was not easy to play, because there were a lot of things to optimize, like your evolutions, or consuming 20 shadows for Carninos, or the timing to play Raider, but in the good hands, it was an extremely strong deck. And just like the other card of the top 5, it was played with Departed Soul Taker after a rework in Unlimited. And there it is, this is my top 20 of the best card in Shadowverse. And for you, which Shadowverse card was the best? Let me know if you agree or disagree with the list in the comment section, and tell me which one you would have put at number 1. This video took a lot of time to make, so I would definitely appreciate if you could leave a like, maybe share with a friend, and consider subscribing for more spicy content like this. I'll see you on the next one, bye bye!